Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of whatever the fuck this is. I'm sure I'm going to come up with a title in the upcoming hour and maybe hour and a half after I've finished recording this, but yeah. I suppose this is going to be primarily combat sports related, combat sports news, combat sports, like Twitter beefs. I don't know. I'll figure it out as I go along. You shouldn't take this seriously because I'm not. And to prove this, to really hammer the point home, I'm actually recording this on my phone. And this is why you probably can hear like various, like all kinds of background noise, and you'll hear them in the upcoming hour. So I apologize in advance. You can always turn this off. I'm not. I'm not asking you to listen to this thing. But yeah, what spurred this on is that there's. If you hadn't noticed, there's currently lots of weird things happening with MMA, in particular, in the world of combat sports, with the from the sport getting allegedly weirdly political. By allegedly, I mean, of course, I'm talking about the concept that sport has always been political in some way or another, and it's just kind of the current political climate and the elections season just kind of bringing this out for everyone to see. Uh, all sorts of online drama, all sorts of various unsavory things happening, fighters being uh, fighters being ousted as either racists, abusers, neo-Nazis, conspiracy nuts, or various combinations thereof. If this made you want to log off and die, I don't blame you. It's how I feel every day. I suppose I could call this thing MMA blackpilled. Seeing as basically what spurred this on is that I kind of want to talk about things that really genuinely personally offend me or annoy me in the world of combat sports. It's just a bit of an audience alienating premise, I suppose, but bear with me. I'm not here to preach. I'm not here to like use this format as a soapbox to stand on and talk about and yell about that you should care about the planet, you should care about things happening on the other side of the globe, care about conspiracy nutters in sports, because really there's just these people are just dime a dozen, and sports has always been a venue for all sorts of weird characters and odious personalities to congregate in. And given the state of, given the cultural, I suppose, peculiarities of the United States of America, where people tend to kind of willingly give platform to various celebrities and spurts, and sports people to spurt out really sort of out there kinds of opinions, you shouldn't really be surprised that the whole thing kind of exploded with the coming of the information age and the age of social media. Because by its nature, the internet allows people with let's say niche tastes to find like-minded people and form groups, and those groups do their best to try and normalize their way of thinking in order to feel accepted, because they've been ostracized for so long, which is, I suppose, a bit of a double-edged sword, but you already know this. I'm sure the audience, whatever audience they may be, is fairly internet savvy at this point, so I'm not going to explain it to explain it in overt detail and or go too deep into this whole thing. And now I just realized that I haven't introduced myself properly. So, for a bit of a background rundown, my name is Iggy, and I've been a combat sports fan for not an extraordinarily long time. It's essentially just maybe 2.5 years. I've been exposed to combat sports since I was a child, and I've been training in combat sports for quite a bit, but it's never been something I dedicated my life to, or something that's been like in any official capacity in like a credentialed school or anything like that. I just kind of grew up thinking that martial arts are neat and that fighting is cool, and that combat sports athletes are pretty dangerous people that tend to be pretty colorful. And so I suppose there's always been something that made me gravitate towards it. But to move the more embarrassing details out of the way, the reason I got into combat sports was because I watched, to my shame, Mayweather versus McGregor, the boxing event. Boxing is, of course, in enormous quotes, with a 50 asterisk on top of each word. But yeah, after watching this, I kind of thought that this is shite. I'd rather watch the real thing, and thankfully, the first Triple G versus Canelo fight happened not long after that, and needless to say, it got me really hooked. I've been an obsessive combat sports fan ever since. I've been studying footage, watching tape, as the common parlance goes. And if this feels really choppy, because it is, I'm apologizing in advance, because English is not my it's a second language, or to be even more technical and strict, it's not even a second language, but rather a third language, because the first two are Russian and the Buryat dialect of Mongolian. So I suppose you're gonna have to tolerate it. But I suppose the more I speak, the better it will become. But yeah, basically what I did for 2 years was shut the hell up and study, and try and deepen my knowledge and broaden my horizons when it comes to combat sports. Watched all sorts of combat sports and all kinds of fights. There was a shameful period in my lifetime when I thought that every fight is good, actually, on some level, because I bought the stupid Joe Rogan narrative that every fight is somehow high level, simply because it's happening in the UFC or is televised, which is obviously something that's been dispelled rather quickly. I've written and been published on the fight site, naturally. Well, the site where this is the site in which podcasts. Wait, let me figure this out. Let me figure this sentence out. It is in this website's podcast network I intend to publish this, hopefully, because if it's because of course the bare minimum the podcast should be listenable. But yeah, basically, I've only just now arrived at a point where I feel comfortable talking about fights from an analysis standpoint, and talking about combat sports from I suppose, an educated amateur standpoint, where I can kind of have a system of knowledge that's in my head that I can reference without sounding like a complete idiot. And while posting about how much things in MMA annoy you, or how hyped you are for the upcoming fights, or etc., etc., while it's fun, it's not necessarily productive, is it? And I've always had this mindset that I have to produce some sort of content, even if it's just a tweet thread. I always kind of put, I suppose, an inordinate amount of effort into writing those. And I used to do podcasting in Russian. It was mainly video game related, and at this point I figured, why not try podcasting? And here you are. And here I am, pouring this dribble down your ears. Right. I have a list of bullet points outlined for this pilot, so I suppose let's get it on. Spend 10 minutes talking about random shit instead of what I wanted to actually talk about, which is a common occurrence. And the reason why further episodes of the Fight Sites MMA podcast haven't featured me as a guest anymore. No, the actual reason was that the fights were shite and we couldn't actually, for the life of us, record anything worthwhile. Everything kind of boiled down to discussions about milking Costa's tits in the end. Which is while fun, it kind of warrants a different show to talk about this thing. And I suppose I'm going to make it my show. So now it's a toss-up between MMA black pilled and milking the giant cow? No. Milking Costa's tits? No, that's too specific. Too specific. We're going to come up with a title by the end of this, I assure you. I'm gonna try my damnedest. But yeah, shitty fights, shit events. The entire month has been essentially just one big puddle of like a knee-deep liquid shit that we had to kind of slog through to get to the good fights. And then immediately after Costa versus Adesanya, there's going to be a fight night card where the main event is Holly Holm squaring up against Irina Aldana. Please be excited. Looking back, let's look back and kind of recount what sort of events we got and what sort of events we had to slog through. Starting with, I suppose, Lewis versus Alainik, or if you want to say his name properly, Alainik. Going to be a lot of this, by the way. And kind of whenever I try and speak English like an English-speaking person, I tend to kind of butcher all the Russian names that I actually know how to pronounce, in order to kind of... It's an automatic thing, so I can't control it. I suppose Lewis Alainik was kind of fun, because it was sort of like a glimpse into the alternate dimension where flyweight and heavyweight switched places. And we saw lots of scrambles, but which nonetheless have been essentially squished by Lewis's belly-on-belly technique, and then Alainik's face got squished by Lewis's fists, which was, I suppose, kind of fun. Followed with Smith versus Rakic, just a nothing event. Nothing of note happened. Nothing of note could happen, and it's just a boring slog from beginning to the end. Followed with Overeem versus Sakai. Overeem turning back the clock for the upteenth time, but except the clock itself is falling apart at the seams. It's kind of the clock hands are rusted. The clock hands are rusted and falling apart. They make squeaky noises, kind of like Stipe's wife's bed whenever he comes home. Wait, no. Kind of like... Let me figure this joke out. I'm going to figure this joke out. Kind of like Daniel Cormier's wife's bed whenever Stipe comes home to visit as a guest, because he's a firefighter, and firefighters fuck other people's wives, you see. Especially cop wives. And cop wives don't mind. Like whenever their actual husbands come home. And this was all followed with Watterson Hill. Yeah, not a lot to say about this one. Not a lot to say about any of them. Which is why I suppose the giant lull, the massive lull, the silence, the radio silence, are the words that mean a pause where no content is produced. And it's kind of been topped off with Covington Woodley, which people refer to as a pay-per-view in disguise, to which the only thing I can say is that get better standards, people, please. I also want the sport to be good, but you shouldn't have to pretend that things are good in order for them to be good. That's the opposite of making the sport better. Which is something I suppose is going to be a running theme throughout this pilot. How do you make things good? And it's kind of a running theme of my entire, of all my works published on the Fight site, and of all the stuff I've been posting on social media, and the stuff I kind of feel very passionate about. But yeah, we kind of got the worst of the worst outcomes with this one. It's kind of like the bad ending of Fight Night cards. And in retrospect, both outcomes kind of sucked ass, because even if Woodley, an objectively much better person than Colby Covington, won, we would have got just a torrential downpour of takes that talk about levels to this shit, and that Woodley is somehow back to his old form. A triumphant return to form for Tyron Woodley. The old Tyron Woodley that still did nothing. That still relied solely on his right hand, which he didn't set up by anything ever. But now we got the other shitty outcome, where an enormous dipshit and then just an all-around kind of a piece of shit and a real downright racist cunt, and Colby Covington winning. And I suppose the only thing that can be found that is good in this outcome is that it allowed me to expand my block list to such an extent. I feel like at this rate I'm going to give Kyle a run for his money in terms of how many people I blocked. By Kyle, of course, I mean Kyle McLaughlin, the founding father of this whole thing. Thankfully, not a racist founding father. There's a point to all this, I assure you. Just bear with me. And then before that, we kind of we saw Dana White's show rear. I was going to say rear his ugly ass, but that doesn't make sense. It just didn't. He could show his face, and it's kind of looks like an ass. Kind of looks ugly. He's pretty ugly. But yeah, the UFC brass stonewalled the hotly anticipated Dustin Poirier versus Tony Ferguson fight, which would have been a guaranteed banger. Two absolutely insane monsters, absolute savages, absolute madmen, absolute what's the other British word British people use to describe insane people that fight real well? Anyway, what the fuck, Dana White? And he used his old song that goes like, "Oh, he didn't want the fight. He didn't want the fight. He's kind of a pussy." Yeah, Dustin Poirier, the insane madman that whose entire career consists of back and forth, insane balls to the wall action brawls, is a pussy. Doesn't want to fight. Makes sense. And just to spite him, that's all. This is all because Dustin Poirier wanted to get paid the amount that he actually deserves to get paid, or be paid, or whatever the fuck. I don't know how the English language works. That's just to spite him, and he negotiated a contract with Michael Chandler 5 years too late to book him as a. I don't know whether this is going to be like a. I don't know whether he's going to be a backup for either Khabib or Gaethje. if either of them pulls out, or just an opponent for Tony. I'm not really clear on that one. But really, how petty can you be? Michael Chandler has been clamoring for this UFC contract ever since 2012, I believe, or 2015 at least. And to the point where it's now been made into a meme, predominantly by Jack Slack. And now, after Dustin Poirier presumably asked for like 500 grand instead of 50k the UFC wanted to pay him for fighting Tony Ferguson in the co-main event to one of the biggest cards this entire year and in the last 3 or 5 years, aside from the, of course, Khabib-Conor fight. Card that with Khabib as a headliner these days is going to be a guaranteed financial hit, which was quickly followed with Nate Quarry in his encouraging news about the class action lawsuit, the move for a class action lawsuit against the UFC that will it all kind of coincided with one another. The Poirier talks and the lawsuit news, which is kind of funny. But yeah, in the beginning there were 1,200 cases of fighters providing evidence of monopoly tactics and being severely underpaid and just scamming shitty practices at the UFC in terms of job security and all that. And the move towards a class action lawsuit will mean that it's going to be one giant case that presents evidence from 1,200 people, and not something that the court will have to work through individually. And as such, it bears a great deal more weight, of course, than all those cases individually. We shall see. We'll see where this one goes, and hopefully somewhere good, somewhere that will allow fighters to actually not have a day job aside from being a fighter, like many people do. Like, for example, Jeff Neal, I think he came out just saying this like a couple of months ago, that he had to return to his day job as a waiter, I believe, or as a server, because of the COVID-19 situation, and then he nearly died. Fighters simply just cannot catch a break in this industry. And I suppose we have to follow this encouraging bit of news with Justin Gaethje and Henry Cejudo, and of course the perennial MAGA soldier Colby Covington being spotted with Ali Abdelaziz on a Trump rally. Well, not exactly being spotted. All of them kind of proudly posted about this on the social media, and I suppose there's a caveat in that you could say that either Cejudo or Justin kind of just got paid to be there, which I suppose is not that far-fetched. Both men kind of proved to be pretty savvy when it comes to generating bank as an MMA fighter, which is gotta respect the hustle, I guess. And Justin in particular strikes me as your typical patriot athlete, like proud to represent the USFA, rise and grind, hard work pays off, all that kind of stuff. So I suppose an invitation from the president is something that just he couldn't turn down on principle. One of those working class people that turn out to be a conservative voter out of sheer ignorance. But the real highlight of the last week was the discussion on Lord Mandalorian's Twitter account about who would win in a fight. A grizzly bear or a silverback gorilla. To those who don't know, Lord Mandalorian is a video game reviewer and a YouTuber. Very good one, one that I genuinely, thoroughly recommend. I don't know if you can say thoroughly recommend. I don't know if that's a combination of words that actually works in the English language, but whatever. But yeah, it kind of revealed that a lot of people don't really understand how large bears are and what sort of weapons they possess, sort of natural advantages they possess over the gorilla. Like, for example, the first one being is that a bear is actually twice the size and twice as heavy as a silverback, as a fully grown silverback. That's in its prime years. Simply because everyone kind of, I suppose, the King Kong movies broke everyone's brain in terms of what a gorilla is capable of. fucking Calvin Cater can't adjust in the middle of a fight and fight like not a Calvin Cater, and the people expect a gorilla to adapt on the fly and invent new ways of using their opposable thumbs, despite the fact that gorilla doesn't possess nearly as much dexterity as a human does in terms of when it comes to their fingers. Yeah, just a highlight of my week. Well, yeah, what this list of things that I found kind of annoying, which of course, your mileage. How do you say that? I'm gonna look this up. Wait. Gonna look this one up.
Mileage. Mileage.
Yeah, that one. It can vary. But I suppose this whole thing comes down to institutions. It's something that's it's the buzzword that's been haunting me ever since I seriously got into discussing combat sports and just things in general, which is something I suppose that could be called Hax's fault. Hax is, of course, a good friend of mine and good friend of the site, who's been featured on multiple episodes of the Danny and Sriram's MMA podcast. Give him a listen. Very smart. Got a big brain, that fella. Yeah, by institutions I mean they're kind of like there's really no real system of interconnected beliefs, interconnected principles that function in MMA. They're kind of, I mean, on the surface they're kind of is, but it's really disorganized. It's really kind of, it's all Wild West sort of thinking. Like it's all, and I mean, for the longest time it used to be just a complete mishmash of various concepts conflicting with each other. The old prize fighting cynicism, the old entertainment industry WWE style deals, like heels versus faces, etc., which is kind of all got tied together with just a hefty dose of corporatism. By corporatism I mean like the sort of the model we can see in the UFC right now, where, for example, with Dustin Poirier versus Tony Ferguson, I can clearly see how the UFC brass saw this fight as being more lucrative for them short term if it were a headliner for like a shitty fight night card, because they've got a schedule, they have to produce content. And in order to sell this content, there has to be some hook, some like pretense of it being good, like a nice box, that hides inside of it, like a turd, essentially. So yeah, it's kind of all just basically just a racket. And really, when you kind of look at this, this model it's unsustainable. The sport itself suffers for it. The viewership suffers. The demographic doesn't grow. It's a kind of like the comic book industry, where they try and milk as much money from the existing fan base of weirdo nerds in order to make their bank, while not expanding their demographic or reaching for other sorts of them like demographics that supposedly should be into comic books, and in fact making it so that it's hard to get into comics by doing things like variant covers, like monthly events that happen across 15 different comic books written by different writers that barely form a coherent story about different characters. The UFC brass kind of just makes one to make bank and fuck off. The Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender series is basically just them attempting to find some more meat to grind, but the problem is that Dana White is also a terrible fucking scout. Because everyone's... I can count... Actually, no, I can't count them. I don't remember any of them. Every single Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender series alumni... I think this is how you say that word. This word. And he ended up basically being a scrub. Either a scrub or a boring kind of sort of all-rounder that can't do any things particularly well. Or like a hire from Alaskan Regionals, which they hired in favor of some like amazingly well-schooled and amazingly well-schooled Russian with a tremendous grasp on fighting fundamentals that's just murdering everyone in organizations like ACA or other like other fight organizations that feature those kinds of fighters. Because with the UFC, if you don't speak good English, you're kind of basically you're fucked. You're either a silent, violent Brazilian, which is a model they've kind of sort of managed to figure out through trial and error, a model of marketing they managed to figure out through trial and error. And if you're a Russian, then you should be like basically Khabib 2.0, like a massive suffocating grappler, while strikers from the post-Soviet world, for example, people like Fiziev, are stuck on the undercard. They do not understand how to market Russian strikers. Petr Yan is the exception, but he's the exception solely because he's the exception in spite of the UFC model. He's not really got much of a following when you think about it, much like Justin Gaethje, which is weird, but it's just a violent finisher. All his fights are incredibly violent, either dominant and violent, or just back and forth and violent, and which ends up with him securing a dominant finish that is incredibly violent. And this whole, like, the shitty... Wait, I'm going to come up with a joke. I'm going to come up with a funny sentence. Give me a moment. The parasitic worm used as a bow to tie up this shit package. This package made out of shit. This package made out of shit is top-heavy pay-per-views once a month with nothing worthwhile on them outside of the main event. And like, this sort of thing will make even the most dedicated fans lose interest eventually. I mean, to say nothing of those who tune in strictly for the big events with big names like the Conor fights. Like, in order to make bank in the UFC, you either have to be Conor big, or you're going to end up with no breathing room and no leverage to negotiate with. And they won't allow anyone. And like Moni, an amazing person who's a prominent MMA Twitter account, and a great artist, follow her at Mon Sneaks. She pointed out that they won't allow anyone to be Conor big, which is the real problem. Nate, for example, is kind of Conor big. Jorge was on his way, but he got sidelined with that short notice Usman fight. And they won't allow anyone to get that big again because Conor transcended the UFC and they couldn't control him anymore. And even Conor in the end didn't really get the slice he wanted because he wanted a share of the UFC, as you might all remember. And now Conor is basically just a retired sex offender alcoholic. Just a sad end. And it kind of ties back to the point about politics and sports. Sports and politics. Sports and politics! Two things people desperately want to be separate, which will never be and never were. Because if you remember, the first Million Gate boxing fight, the first boxing fight to break the Million Gate benchmark was Jack Dempsey versus Georges Carpentier, if I am pronouncing that name correctly, which was promoted by the legendary boxing promoter Tex Rickard. And the way they promoted this fight was basically based on nationalism. The old American hero versus basically a filthy Frenchman that eats frogs and is ugly. Unlike Jack Dempsey, the real American hero and the literal hobo. Which is, I suppose, kind of, things were a bit more complicated than that. Carpentier was seen as a war hero, and Jack Dempsey was seen as a loser draft dodger. But there were more ways you could look at this. What I mean by that is basically, politics has always been a good way of selling fights. The two go hand in hand. The Rumble in the Jungle, a fight, incidentally, that's been the venue for which and the promotion of which and all that kind of logistical stuff was handled by an African dictator. The fight took place in Kinshasa, Zaire, now Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was, at the time, of course, run by the... Mobutu Sese Seko was his name. Took me a moment there. And Muhammad Ali was touted as a great champion for the cause of black power and equality, while George Foreman was vilified as a sellout and a representative of the colonial powers, which was kind of exacerbated by his social faux pas that he committed by bringing his German shepherds into Zaire. He's a great dog lover, but this particular breed of dogs was used by the colonial authority to torture locals, to torture the Congolese, at the time Zaireans. Of course, this is just a demonym, not the name of the individual peoples that live there. But yeah, this is what basically what the white colonial powers did to torture black people and harass them and sick those dogs on them. And this is a tactic that's been employed by Ali's promoters and Ali himself many times. An especially damning example was his promo campaign against Joe Frazier, whom he notoriously called an Uncle Tom and a rabbit, despite himself coming from a relatively well-off family, well, as far as well-off as black families could go back in those days. Meanwhile, Joe Frazier came from was a genuine article in terms of coming from the ghetto. He was. If anyone's been impressed in his life, it was Joe Frazier. He's experienced the worst things America of that time could offer. I'm not saying, of course, that Muhammad Ali was a privileged man by any metric. if you're black and you lived in those days, and if you're black and you live today, you have to deal with all sorts of awful people on a daily basis, and an awful system on a daily basis, which is something I can sympathize with, being Mongolian, that lives in Russia and being born in Russia. What I'm getting at is that combat sports and prize fighting as a concept started out as something inherently shady. Pugilism and prize fighting in their modern form took shape as first took shape as shady rich aristocrats just with too much money to spare and an inordinate amount of free time on their hands, betting on weird stuff out of boredom. Basically, that's what combat sports started out as. And you can see this thing right now, happening right now, right before our eyes, with Colby Covington using the MAGA soldier angle to harass Tyron Woodley, who is an outspoken Black Lives Matter supporter, to generate bank. And it's something he does in every fight. But the thing is, after a certain point, where does a gimmick end and an actual person begin? When you really look at the UFC right now in its current state, which is something that Karim Zidane pointed out in his excellent articles on Bloody Elbow about the I suppose radicalization of the UFC. I don't know if that's the actual title. I don't believe it is, but the point was that Dana White is an open supporter of Donald Trump, and Trump is apparently a big fan of the UFC, and he has been a big fan of combat sports for a long time, with him granting his venues for use as an arena for the Mike Tyson fights. The Trump Plaza has been used as a venue for Mike Tyson fights many, many times. And I suppose you could say that it's kind of there's another factor at play here, which is the UFC corporatism that's inherently rooted in a short-term profit-seeking mindset. That's more about not worrying about your bedfellows and kind of generating bank where money is to be had. And at this stage, this is the money is with those in power, or at least they believe that to be the case. And they believe the predominant market is the conservative crowd, because since since that crowd's been turned away by things like NFL athletes and NBA athletes speaking out against social injustice and all that, and that crowd, as a rule, hates anyone who gets too big for their boots, so to speak. And the UFC saw a potential market in there, and they kind of gobbled it all up. But there is also an argument to be made that combat sports and fighting in general kind of is something that your typical men are becoming soft, the world is going to shit crowd tends to gravitate, because it's fighting is primal, fighting is violent, fighting is a manly art, or at least it's been painted this way since the Hellenistic times, which is incidentally an era in the human history that's been co-opted and romanticized by legitimate neo-Nazis time and again, and imperialists as well. Well, that's kind of neither here nor there. It's a topic in itself, a giant can of worms. Yeah, but the problem with this is kind of like, yeah, even if you accept the argument that the sports are becoming too political, which is a take I disagree with vehemently. You could argue that from a business standpoint, it kind of swung back in the opposite direction into the other kind of politics, the sort of politics that, my argument, well, the point of my argument is that many people are complaining about sports becoming too political simply because people are bringing up points that don't gel with your personal politics, which is something that I believe to be the case with many an MMA fan. Many people can find this annoying, and many people can find this alienating, and I absolutely sympathize with that. And reading about combat sports news is something that makes me feel deeply unhappy at times. It's just saying something because I live in Siberia and I regularly see. Well, here's a fun exercise for you to take to do whatever. Try and tune in for the Russia Today news broadcast. Try and watch it for more than 2 hours, and then fact check every single point that they've brought up talking about Russia. Essentially, you can't even forgo fact checking it actually and googling every bullet point presented and just kind of assume the opposite, and you'd be mostly right. This is what's it like to be a Russian citizen nowadays. So really, to my Western listeners, Western followers, Western mutuals, particularly American ones, don't be so sad. Things can always get worse. But yeah, I suppose this is something of an intro to my hopefully upcoming works. Something that I feel it's something that's not discussed at length and not discussed in depth. The question of institutions in combat sports, the institution of combat sports as a phenomenon, and what it entails, the inner workings of it, the historical and cultural context for all things that happen. Because while these things sometimes happen in MMA, they also happen for a reason. Those reasons are deeply rooted in the historical and cultural context of combat sports itself. And it's an interesting topic I feel fairly passionate about, and something that I wish to create content about. And hopefully this preview didn't alienate you people too much. By you people, I mean MMA fans, and just people marginally interested in combat sports. This has been a bit of an unscripted, rambly mess. I just kind of wanted to outline where I'm coming from here, and introduce myself. And politics and all that stuff is not the only things I wish to talk about, of course, because even I am not equipped to deal with this shit on a daily basis. If I were forced at gunpoint to produce a weekly a weekly news digest, a weekly show about politics and politics and combat sports, but in particular, I just ask them to shoot me. I'm just going to tell them, just do it. Just end this. I have no interest in experiencing this. I've been following the news in combat sports for quite a while now, and a bullet to the head is something. It would be a bit of a new experience for me, and definitely a more pleasant one than just reading about yet another fighter turning out to be an anti-vaxxer or something like that, which is just disheartening. People who are able to separate the fighter from the person and just kind of not bother themselves, not bother learning about anything else aside from watching their fights. I really envy you. Like, no joke. This I genuinely kind of envy the sort of enjoyment you could possibly have, the fun you have watching the sports just for the fights. It's something that I wish I still had, but I obviously don't anymore. But yeah, thankfully, next week we got, or this week rather, we got Adesanya versus Costa. Finally, a good fight. One that is genuinely extremely compelling and interesting and deep. The build-up itself has been fairly bizarre, with Costa, with it basically being Costa declaring his, in a Conan the Barbarian fashion, declaring his eternal love for Israel Adesanya, and Israel Adesanya playing hard to get, which is kind of the dynamic of the fight itself, which is something we're going to see in the octagon, and except expressed with punches and kicks instead of shirts being ripped open and live on air, and Adesanya striking JoJo's Bizarre Adventure poses. We got that to look forward to, and of course the Gage versus Khabib fight. So maybe, just maybe, there's not even going to be enough material for me to bitch about in terms of combat sports news, but maybe you'll hear me more excited to talk about combat sports than this. Yeah, this has been kind of a therapeutic experience for me, of a sort. I really enjoy speaking about things much more than writing about them, funnily enough, despite the fact that I find that whenever I write something, I can actually formulate and express myself in a much more coherent way, which is something I believe that's true for everyone, or at least a significant portion of you. Yeah, I'm now kind of thinking against calling this MMA black belt because it's kind of a depressing title, and Bloody Elbow already has MMA Depressed Us, hosted of course by Conor Rebush and Zane Simon and Phil McKenzie, the boy Phil McKenzie. But yeah, subscribe to the Fight Side channel, give them money on Patreon, they make good stuff. Listen to Danny and Freeron's podcast, it's really good. And read my articles that I have published that had been published on the Fight Site, namely the UFC's Meatpacking Plan series. It's a 3-parter. Part 4 hopefully coming sometime in the future. The first part kind of started out as me just bitching about things I don't like, and it kind of grew in scope. The third part concerns fighting fundamentals and how MMA kind of sucks at employing them, and MMA camps in particular suck at employing them and instilling them, making their fighters internalize the MMA fundamentals. Read that if you want it. I put a lot of effort into writing that one. Much more effort than in recording this podcast, naturally. But yeah, looking forward to your feedback, and stay tuned. Dahin, Ozatra, Berte.